Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share some Joyful Candy Cane cards. This is the Joyful Candy Cane 3D embossing folder of the month for October 2024. I didn't have it when I was doing my Spellbinders Club videos, so it didn't make those videos. So I'm just doing a separate one with this background. And I absolutely love it. It's a combination of poinsettias as well as candy canes. It's absolutely gorgeous. I plan to make two different cards with this. So I have a piece of 8.5 by 5.5 inch Hammermill cardstock. I'm just embossing the whole sheet at once, and then I'll cut it down to make two cards. So look at this absolutely beautiful background. And really just this background alone, you don't really need a whole lot more. It's absolutely stunning. So for my first card, I'm going to keep my background really simple and clean. And then for my second card, I'm going to get a little bit more complicated and make it a little bit more colorful. So I'm cutting these backgrounds down to 4 inches by 5.25 inches. So my mats are going to be 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. For the first card, I want to use this Poinsettia Bloom die. This one is a gorgeous die set. It's one of Yana's dies. I think this one was from last year. For the outline part of it, I'm going to cut some silver cardstock from the Treasured Silver Cardstock pack. This one is the matte finish. I wanted really the poinsettia to shine, but I still wanted to have a little bit of that metallic accent to it. And I thought the silver was going to work perfectly for the color scheme that I was going to use. Now, I only plan on using the outline of the die here, but I am taking all of the pieces out. I'm going to set them to the side, and I will likely use them for a future project. These are perfect for inserting into a different outline to create a second card. And I'll show you a version of it partway through the video because I use the outline part of my second poinsettia die cut. It'll make sense later. So I'm also cutting a piece of white Hammermill cardstock with that same die. I'm leaving the pieces in there for a moment. We'll take them out in just a moment. This die also has a shadow part, so I'm using Vellum to cut that out. This is a perfect part or perfect piece to glue all of the pieces onto. And I like to use Vellum because then it's very subtle. You could use just white cardstock if you wanted, but I like the fact that the Vellum, you can still see the outline, but it's a lot more subtle than just plain cardstock. So before we take those white pieces out of the detailed part of the die, I'm taking a piece of press and seal and I'm just pressing it on the back, and then I'm going to take those pieces out. This way everything comes out all at once, and it's going to make the technique that I'm going to use much easier to do because I don't have to worry about trying to figure out where these pieces go in the poinsettia. I am going to trim that press and seal down so I don't have to fight with it while I'm doing my ink blending. And before I start doing that ink blending, I'm going to take that matte silver outline and I'm going to glue it down to the vellum piece so that can be sitting drying while I'm doing my ink blending. I'm just using some Barely Art glue here. I have it in a nice fine line bottle. This is perfect for doing detailed die cuts like this because I can get a really nice fine line to it. And I can also use this same glue for my layers and gluing all of those pieces of cardstock down. So once I have this down, I like to put an acrylic block on my pieces while they're drying. It just keeps everything nice and flat, especially because I'm gluing to vellum here. Vellum doesn't like moisture, so by keeping it flat, I can make sure it's going to dry properly. To do my ink blending on my white die cut here, I have some large Spellbinders ink blending brushes, and I'm starting off with Kitsch Flamingo, and then I'm going to go in with Picked Raspberry. Now, the brush that I'm using for the Picked Raspberry is smaller than the Spellbinders large ones because I want it in a smaller area and I want that ink more concentrated. Typically, when I'm doing this technique, I will do my ink blending for the entire flower, but in this case, I'm not doing it because I want the inner petals to have shadow towards the inside or darker color towards the inside. And then I want to do some more ink blending on the outer petals. I want them to be a little bit darker, but I don't want to get the tips of these petals too dark. So by taking them out, inserting them or paper piecing them into my poinsettia outline, I can now do that ink blending on my other white part or white poinsettia die cut and not worry about getting the ink too dark in the center. So I also glued down the center of the poinsettia, and I just use that same Barely Art glue in the fine line bottle. paper piece them or piece them into the outline, and it's really easy to know exactly wherever or where each one goes when you have all the pieces here in the whole die cut. It makes it really easy to pick it out of one and put it into the other and know exactly where it goes. So I'm going to use the same colors for the outer petals. I'm doing that picked raspberry, a little bit darker towards the center for this one, and then the Kitsch Flamingo. It's going to be a little bit darker on the outside petals than it was on the inside ones, but it's still fairly light. You still see a light amount of color there. Another option here would be to start with pink cardstock and then do the ink blending on there. But I really like when you can do that ink blending and get a really, really pale color towards the tips of them. I just love that look to it. So when I'm gluing these petals in, I typically will do between 3 to 5, just depending on the size. I don't put the glue in all of the pieces because I don't want that glue to start drying. And again, vellum doesn't really like moisture. Because I'm using liquid glue, sometimes it starts to warp the vellum. But I do find that just doing a few petals at a time, it works enough so that I don't get that warping. And then by putting that acrylic block on there, I can make sure that everything stays nice and flat. Now, just because I really liked the way that outline looked, I wanted to insert all the silver pieces just to see what it looked like. And there it was, just sharing it with you so you can see what it looks like. I think that would make a beautiful, unique card as well. I'm not doing that in this video. I'm going to save that aside and I will make another card at some point. I'll store it with that poinsettia die just to make sure I know where all those pieces are. For my embossed background, I initially was going to leave it white. But after doing that poinsettia, I thought it would look really pretty with just kind of a kiss of some light ink blending towards the outside. I don't want it heavy. I want that poinsettia to shine, but I thought just a little tiny bit would be beautiful. For the matte behind my embossed piece, I'm using another piece of the matte silver cardstock. That, as I said before, was cut to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8, and then I can glue down my embossed piece. And I'm only going to see a tiny little bit of that silver sliver or silver matte to it. Now, had I thought about this ahead of time, because originally I was thinking that I was going to matte this in some pink cardstock, what I would have done was cut that matte out and then cut my poinsettia in the center of that matte. And then when it came time to gluing everything together, that embossed piece would cut that open or would cover that opening in that matte silver. So it's a way to make your cardstock go a little bit farther. I hadn't thought ahead of time, or I changed my mind in the middle of it. So I end up using more cardstock than that. That's okay. Just an idea if you want to, utilize or make your cardstock go a little bit farther. To finish this piece off, I just added a touch of stickles towards the center of the poinsettia, and then I added some glossy accents on the berries. I'm going to set that aside to completely dry while I work on the second card, but that's just going to add a little bit more texture and a little bit more of a different finish rather than having just the plain embossed and then just the matte and matte cardstock. It's going to have some shine and some sparkle. For the second background, I'm going to start off with the Glimmer of the month for October, and I'm going to just use that sentiment, and I'm going to foil that in matte silver glimmer foil. For the finished card, I'm also going to be using some die cuts from the Delivering Joy sleigh die. I'm going to be using the poinsettia as well as some of the greenery, and then the Parcel and Post Christmas decorations die set. For that one, I'm going to be using the candy cane. I wanted to mimic the shapes and the foliage that were in the background of my embossed background there. And those to me worked perfect for the idea that I had in my head. So to do this sentiment, I'm going to tape this down to my Hammermill cardstock. I want to make sure that it's not going to shift and move while I'm doing my foiling. And taping it down is the best way to do that. And I did all of that while I was waiting for everything to heat up. Once my glimmer machine was hot, I put my stacking down onto the hot surface, put the plates on top, press the timer button, and once that timer button was done, I put it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine, and then I waited a few moments before removing that tape just to let that cool just a little bit, make it a little bit easier to handle. While I'm taking that off of the background, I have my solid hot foil plate on my Glimmer machine warming up. I always like to do solid hot foiling right after doing the foiling, just to make sure that foil gets used to its as much as possible. Now, I don't plan on using this solid hot foiled sentiment with this video, so I will save it, but I find it's much easier to save cardstock sentiments or cardstock foiled pieces than bits of glimmer foil, and it only takes a few more minutes to do that solid hot foiling while I have my machine hot. Now I can take my die, or the die that goes with that Glimmer of the Month sentiment, I can tape it in place and I can die cut it. Now I always like to tape it in place just to make sure that it's not going to move and go misaligned while I'm doing my die cutting. That way I can just ensure that it's going to die cut perfectly. And I'm going to do the same thing with the solid as well. Again, I'll save that for a future project, but you can see the difference here. And I always like to do the two of them because sometimes I will use the positive foil and sometimes I will change my mind and the solid hot foil looks best at the end. So it's best to have both of them. You can put it on your project and see which one you prefer. So for the technique that I'm using for the second card here, I am going to do some ink blending on that embossed surface, but I am doing it on the back part of it. So this is all of the images, the poinsettia, the foliage, the candy cane, they're all recessed in here. And this is important for the technique that I wanted to do for this particular one. It's a technique that I've seen several videos doing it. I don't know who first came up with it. I would credit them if I knew who was the originator to it. But it creates a really, really cool look. Now, another option would be to use black ink on the embossing folder when you're embossing, but you're not going to get the same look as this. And the main reason is the pine branches are so minimally recessed in there. There's such fine detail that I think if you inked the embossing folder, you'd get a lot of black ink on those pine branches and you'd lose them. So by doing the technique this way, you get those details and you don't lose it. So for the first color that I used there, that was Selvage Patina. And then I'm using Evergreen Bough. Now you can see that even though I just used one green for that first color there, I still have a couple different greens showing up. There was a bit of green left on my brush, and even though I used some scrap paper to try to get as much of it off as possible, I still get a variation of greens on that background. I don't necessarily mind quite as much because it just gives some variety to the background, and really you don't see a lot of the difference when the background is finished. So I just kept going with it. For the darker color here, this is the Evergreen Bough, and for that I'm using a detailed ink blending brush just to make sure that I have a little bit more control over where that ink is going. I can put that at the base of the holly leaves as well as the base of the pine needles and just get a little bit of visual shading in there. Now I can go in and start inking those poinsettias. So the first color I'm using here is that Kitsch Flamingo, and I'm using a larger ink brush or blending brush for that. Then I'm going to go in with the same picked raspberry. These are the same two colors that I used for the last card. So these are going to coordinate beautifully together. I'm being a little bit more heavy-handed with the ink than I was on that first card. So for that first card, I was going for a very light, subtle, soft look. This one is definitely kind of the opposite of that. This is a lot more color, and as I continue, you'll see why, and you may have seen it from the thumbnail on this video. So the last detail I want to add here is on the candy canes. I have a Tombow marker. It's a nice dark red, and I'm just using it to put stripes on those candy canes. Now I couldn't use an ink pad here because I wouldn't be able to get enough detail. So by using a marker, I'm able to get that detail. The place that I'm putting those stripes on are the stripes that are embossed in that background. And when I was doing my ink blending, most of them got some green on them. So by putting that red over top, I'm kind of covering that green to it. Now, the rest of the background here, I'm using some Black Soot Distress ink and just going over that background. It's going to neaten up my inking. It's going to cover all of the raised parts. And this is the background that's raised because my image piece is recessed. Now, as I was doing it, I didn't want to press too hard and get too much black ink on those images. So I found the best way to be able to press firmly but not give too much pressure was to put that piece of cardstock back on the embossing folder. Then I could press firmly, and I knew I wasn't going to crush any of that embossed background. With that done, I can set that to the side. I have my die cuts that I'm going to add to the front. And I just die cut those out of white cardstock, and I'm using the same ink colors that I used to do the inking on my background, and I'm inking those die cuts. So they're going to coordinate beautifully. This is just going to give a little bit of extra texture. To be honest, you don't need to necessarily do these extra pieces because there's so much going on in that background. If you wanted to just put that background down and then put a sentiment on top of it, that would be enough. But I really wanted to have just a little bit of die cut dimension and die cut texture to this. So I glued down a piece of brushed silver cardstock for my mat. I would have used matte silver, but apparently it's my favorite one in the treasured silver cardstock pack, and I didn't have any left, so I used some brush. So it was the closest thing to it, and I figured because there's such a small area around the outside, it was enough to tie in that silver, but it wasn't going to be super obvious that it was a totally different finish from my matte silver foiling. With that on the side drying, I'm ready to assemble my die cuts before adding them to the front of the card. So my candy canes, I die cut the solid piece out of crimson cardstock, the piece that has the detail cut out of it, that's just white cardstock, gluing them together with that Barely Art glue, and I'm just going to set them aside to dry. My poinsettias, I like to use my fingers to curl the petals, and then I just use a dot of glue in the center to glue those together. I'm not going to put anything into the center, or I'm not going to put any die cuts in the center of that poinsettia. I'm going to use some stickles to finish off that poinsettia as well as the embossed ones. But with my background drying underneath the acrylic block, it's the perfect opportunity to play on top of that acrylic block and figure out exactly where I want those die cut pieces to go. Much easier to do this ahead of time and figure out the design rather than start gluing everything down and then change your mind or decide that something isn't quite right. Now, because some of these die cuts are going to be tucked under my sentiment, I am starting to glue them down. I'm just placing the sentiment where I want it to go, gluing down some of the ones that are being tucked underneath, and then I'm going to put my sentiment on top of that. Now this cluster with the candy canes and the poinsettia, I'm gluing this first, then I'm going to glue the sentiment, and then there's going to be a few of the greenery pieces that go underneath, and I'm just going to tuck them under. The glue will still be wet enough that I'll be able to lift it up to do that. Now, when I was doing the inking for my pine branches as well as my holly, I made sure that my pine branches were just a little bit darker. So when I went to put the holly branches or the holly leaves on top of it, they would still show up on top of those pine branches. Now, originally, when I was going to do my sentiment, I was just going to do it flat. I wasn't going to do any dimension to it. But as I was putting those die cuts down, I just felt like I needed to die cut a few extra of with the die cut, just with some white cardstock, and glue those behind the sentiment just to give it a little bit more dimension and a little bit more weight, shall we say, on the front of the card. It just makes it stick up a little bit more and just makes it a little bit more prominent from that background. With that done, I can glue that to the front of the card, and it just has a little bit more visual dimension. You could also use foam pop dots for this, but it's so easy to grab some scrap cardstock and use that, or utilize that, and die cut those and then glue them together. And it's also just a little bit more firm on your cardstock or on your card. Once that is glued in place, this is when I'm putting the extra greenery on. I'm just lifting some of the areas of that sentiment up just to tuck those stems in. Again, this glue hasn't completely set and dried yet, so it's still pliable enough and it's still wet enough that I can easily do that. And then once I have everything where I want it to go, I'll just put my acrylic block on top of that and let that completely dry. Now, even though that acrylic block is going to flatten the petals of my poinsettia a little bit, all I need to do is take my fingers, go under those petals, and just lift them up a little bit. If you wanted them to stay dimensional while you, say, are mailing this card, I would opt to do a small pop dot behind there, or you can squeeze some glue behind there and let that dry just to give it a little bit of support from behind. The last step was to put those stickles in the center of that poinsettia, as well as the center of the poinsettias on my embossed background. Mainly for those ones, it's because I have pink ink in there and I thought that looked a little bit odd in the center of the poinsettia. So the silver just adds a little bit of sparkle and just gives that poinsettia a little bit more of a sparkly center. It just makes them look a little bit nicer. And then we have the second card, or the first card that I made there, with that die cut poinsettia. I love that beautiful soft look it has with that embossed background, and I love the contrast of the two of them together. So you can get really soft and subtle with it, or you can get a lot more bright or with a lot more color. So you can really customize it to what you want. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you spending time with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.